yeah, it's just crazy. Like I see a lot of the follow the money stuff, like follow the money. There are billionaire trans people
Yeah,
that give money to these causes. Therefore, they must have all of these devious, implications, blah, blah, blah. They're pulling the strings. And it's
yeah.
like, they're rich people giving money to causes. Isn't that what rich people do? Have their pet causes and they give them money? Like, do you have any
And if,
proof
and if,
that
and if the rich and happen trans, well, then of course they're going to back their own horse.
exactly,
Um,
like it's just like, and if you suggest that that's a bit crazy, like I, I suggested on a comment to a video, like, like you're listening to this person and they're just, like they have ties or they used to be tied to deep eco-terrorist like groups that became eco-terrorist groups, so they are as extreme in their left-wing politics as they can possibly be. They're conspiratorial already, and then they've jumped onto this, like they don't have a great history and you're taking their word as it's the biblical truth that this is happening. They haven't really shown you
yeah.
any damning evidence that is conclusive. They've just suggested things, and you've gone along with it. Like it's hey, welcome, hello. I'm just doing an introduction to a conversation that I had with Paulie, who is a trans woman from the state of Victoria, which is just south of me. Paulie has been in and around trans spaces for over 20 years at this point, just over 20 years, and has noticed the shift in what's being said and what's acceptable within that time frame. So is in that way kind of like an embodiment of the history of the trans community in the way that older trans people are. If you've had the good fortune of bumping into Paulie online or in person, then you would be in no doubt that you have encountered someone who is like deeply ethical, no nonsense, very realistic, and I kind of think seriously well read as well. She is like just a seriously like impressive independent thinker, and I had a really great time talking to her. The conversation, there's two parts because it went for a long time, so yeah, it's quite fascinating, and we get into some some critical stuff. Just a note, we recorded it a couple of weeks ago, so we talk about a few things that happened last week that happened probably a few weeks ago now, and the video of me is lost in my computer somewhere, so there's no video of me, so I have tried to make it kind of a bit visually appealing to kind of keep interest, but it's definitely it's definitely worth looking at because the information that resides within Paulie is impressive to say the least. Anyway, I hope you enjoy. Cheers.
All righty, so I'm Paulie. I'm a person who struggled not so much with my gender. That's kind of a new way of saying things. It's more been a struggle with my sex, and so sort of for almost all my life I've wanted to be female. So I'm sort of an unusual case. Although I'm a late person who's come out late in life, I came out to my wife and began the discussion with my wife over 30 years ago. And so I haven't lived like a lie in my personal relationship and what have you. And I think that has impacted a lot on the way I see myself and how I see the whole trans issue and what have you. But I've never thought that I was female or that I was a girl or that I was a woman. That was something I wanted to be. I started hanging around the trans community on the fringes of it 20 years ago, and there was more people kind of talking like that. And then in the last 10 years, I've seen this real, I am a woman, and for young people, I am a girl, and then sort of 5 years ago, it became I'm actually female. And it's kind of like, well, actually, if I was female, I would never have had these issues, because that was the whole dilemma, you know. And so I kind of became critical of what people were saying in the trans community and that whole thing and whatever. I had started a trans support group in Geelong, Victoria, and facilitated that and what have you. And I ended up deciding to walk away from all of that and start to speak out about some of the craziness in the trans community. That I'm just one of those people that I can't just sit back and kind of ignore it. So then I started looking into some of the craziness and what have you, and through that started looking for other people who shared similarities with some of the views that I held, and some of those people were gender critical feminists and radical feminists.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess a little while ago I began to reach the point where I would call it, I reached peak radical feminist, peak gender critical, where I just went, there's in that movement, there's just so much craziness that I needed to sort of distance myself from it and then speak about what's going on in that community. But in fairness to that community as well, you know, I've talked to some radical feminists and what have you who I've had some really good discussions with, and individually they seem genuine and earnest in their desire to have proper dialogue and to see if we can work a way forward. Just like in the trans community, and I think you're one of those people, I'm one of those people, and I think there's a number of others of us in the trans community. Well, they exist in the radical feminist and gender critical community. But as a community, their community is as crazy as the craziness that I see in the trans community. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of interesting that that it's coming around full circle in that way, because like there's feminist theory and then there's academia, but there's a lot of crossover there. Like a lot of the feminist theory comes from academia, and it started out as women's studies and then became gender studies, and that led off into crazy, you know, gender land. And it's also kind of a bit the same in feminist, like, so they're kind of basing this, they're so similar in many ways, but they have this one major divergent point. So it was kind of really only a matter of time before the fringes of, and it kind of is the fringe of, you know, the radical feminists became, you know, almost as, you know, there's an age differential as well. So like the trans rights activists that are the most rabid are younger, so they have less, you know what I mean? Like they're just less in touch with day-to-day reality. So they're going to be more hyperbolic than, you know, 40, 50, 60-year-old radical feminists who have been around for decades. But it is really interesting watching the overlap of the two sets of behaviors, especially when you've been, like, because I've been around for 30 years at this point. So I've seen these arguments play out a few times before.
I think one of the other things too is that because there are people in the community who are seeing the craziness going on in the trans community and trans politics and what have you, is that particularly women are looking for someone who's raising those issues and speaking about it. So they see, you know, gender critical and radical feminists are speaking about it. So they jump on board and declare that they're radical feminists and gender critical feminists and what have you, but they haven't actually done any theoretical reading behind it and what have you. And a lot of them are espousing things that, in my view, you know, I'm not a radical feminist, but in my view, it's actually anti-radical feminist, some of the things that, you know, as a quick example, you know, I've seen a couple of radical people who, you know, females who claim to be radical feminists who are quite happy on social media to justify or even praise into male violence when they think a male person deserves that violence. And I just think that that's completely opposed to radical feminism, because, you know, if you encourage into male violence, then that's going to spill out and there's always going to be violence against women.
I think there's a problem with definitions as well, like people not quite knowing what radical feminist, or just having multiple definitions of what radical feminist is to them. And I've bumped into this a few times when you talk about, these radical feminists that are extremists, and there'll be someone who is a self-described radical feminist in the group that you're talking to, and they just kind of, some of them go off and others just kind of go, no, hold on a minute. What do you mean when you say that? Because I'm a radical feminist and I take offense to that. And then you kind of have to backpedal a bit, kind of explain, and then kind of, you know what I mean? Like kind of go, no, I'm talking about these people over here that are the extremist radical feminists. I'm not talking about radical feminism in general. I'm talking, but you know what I mean, about the extreme. And they go, oh, okay, well, I haven't seen any of that. And then they see it and they go, what the hell is that? And you're like, yeah, that's what I was talking about.
And so one of the things that I wanted to kind of raise with you that I was wondering if you had something to say was that the whole TERF thing, the trans exclusionary radical feminist, that has been used by the trans community as an attempted kind of a slur on feminists and what have you. And so I don't support that use of it in that way. But I actually do think that radical feminism is actually trans exclusive. And they always argue that, of course, it's exclusive of me because I'm male, and I totally support that. I don't belong in a radical feminist circle. Females should have their place to talk about their issues in the world, just like as a trans person, I should have my space to do that. Yeah. And so I don't call it exclusionary that I'm not in those circles. But I also don't believe that what they say is that trans men, because trans men are female, they're welcome in the radical feminist circle. But I don't think any trans men would feel comfortable in a radical feminist circle. And I personally haven't actually come across one who is in a radical feminist circle.
Well, it's kind of radical. Well, it comes back to that whole thing where people have this misconception that transition just changes your outside. Like it doesn't, you know what I mean? Like it actually changes as much internally as it does externally. The way I think is completely different. Like the way I relate to my emotions is completely different. So while I still have a window of perspective into femininity and how that works and how it's structured and what they mean when they say X, Y, and Z, that may or may not be how I feel about it. I may not agree with them. And the way the way that I respond to something or the way I phrase something can become highly problematic you know what I mean? Like they kind of say that in passing, but then the reality of that situation is not going to be what they think it is, because I'm not the same person that I was before. Like I kind of think that my basic biology has stayed the same on several levels, but it has also shifted considerably as well. So I kind of think that trans is a separate category of, it's not male, it's not, it's not strictly male, it's not strictly female, like it is something else entirely, and we don't quite have a full grasp of what that is or what it means for people individually or for society as a whole as yet. And that's part of what the struggle is. But yeah, I don't think, people say, oh, trans men are our sisters. And it's like, well, that's highly offensive to pretty much everyone I know, but not because they're not, not for the reasons that people think. They're like, oh, well, you're just delusionary and you think this, that, and the other. And it's like, well, no, because my perspective has shifted considerably and I don't think the same way that I used to think, and I don't believe the things that I used to believe, so I don't belong in that group anymore, because most of my perspectives are, like I can see that window, but a lot of my natural perspectives now are much more male in many ways. Like that's the framing that I like, the lens that I see a lot of stuff through now.
Because the reality of your experience in day-to-day life is when you walk into a shop to buy a carton of milk, the people in there treat you as a man coming in and buying a carton of milk. So that alters your experience well. Yeah. And we can try and have a black and white understanding of this and say that, trans men are female and therefore they're women and what have you. But the reality of day-to-day life is that they don't experience the world in the way that women do.
No. And that hasn't been the case for me for 20 years. Like, you start transitioning within the first 2 years, you completely pass, and then you live the rest of, like, there's this, because the most visible trans people that are online are people that are within the first 5 years of their transition. People have this misconception that that's what it is, and it's like, no, that's just the first exciting chunk. After that, it becomes very mundane, and like, it doesn't come up very often, and like, being seen as male is just or being seen as a man is just my daily experience. And, like 20 years down the road, you don't even think about it anymore. Like, there's this whole fetish idea that, like, that when someone genders me as male or as he, that I get some kind of charge off it. It happens more for trans women, that being called she is some kind of sexual charge. And it's like, it's really rather not. Like, it becomes kind of boring. Like, it's not the case at all.
Yeah. So getting back to the is radical feminism trans exclusionary? The other thing is that, like, trans men are not going to feel comfortable in a circle of women who openly on the internet use words like butcher and mutilate their bodies. Yeah. So, if you're going to talk that kind of language, do you really think that you can, represent and welcome trans men into your radical feminism? And they can't. And so I do actually, through practice, they can say what they want to say in theory about trans men are females and they're welcome into their feminism, but in practice they're not. And it would kind of be like, here in Australia, us having some kind of a community where we say Aboriginal people are welcome, but within that community we use words that are openly racist and derogatory towards
pretty much
Aboriginal people. They wouldn't, even if we said, they can come along, they wouldn't come along because they wouldn't feel comfortable.
No.
And so I do think it is exclusionary.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Which again, I don't actually have a problem with that, because I don't belong in radical feminism. And if you don't have the same experiences as the females in there and whatever, because you're, when you're out and about in life, you're seen as a man, well then, you probably don't belong in there as well. So if they don't want us in there and we don't want to be in there, well, then I don't see any problem,
No, I don't know that they have to be quite as, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if they've preemptively shot themselves in the foot in a couple of ways, like by being so adamant in the first place. They've kind of left themselves very little wiggle room, and this is just a large grey area, like, I don't even know what I'm saying. But yeah, so I don't have a problem. Like, you don't really hear men talk about, you hear gay men talk about it now because that's getting a little bit out of control, but you don't hear about men rejecting trans men because they just don't really, they're not threatened by it at all. It's not a thing.
So sorry, so to just follow you, you're saying that men are not threatened by trans men, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like, they're not, like, you don't talk about men being, and there's lots of stuff going on in men's bathrooms with, all sorts of things where they want privacy, but they just don't really project that out, whereas women tend to be much more adversarial about trans women in all areas. And I kind of think, I don't know, like, I wonder if that's, I don't know. I wonder if they haven't, like, given themselves because it's just such a no across the board, and there's no room for wiggle room. They've kind of left themselves nowhere to go. So, you know what I mean? Like, they're not like, well, it's okay here, and I'll, like with the pronoun thing, it's like, I'm going to call everybody he, no matter what. I don't care. It's ideological. And then you've got people that pass completely that you'd never pick, like, and it's like, now you're just like an asshole.
But as well as that, how does it just work out in practical day-to-day practice? Yeah. And I'm not a fan of Blair White, but Blair White made a comment, although I agree with some of her things and whatever, I find it sensationalist and just chasing ratings kind of for her channel at times and what. But as Blair one time sort of said something about, in her day-to-day movements throughout the world, does she, do people really expect her to be called him? When she, everywhere she walks, people just assume that she's female.
Yeah, pretty much.
So just practicality terms, how would you make that work? How would you have it that everyone, and in order to follow the ideological position that all males have to be called him, radical feminists end up demanding the same thing as a trans community, that every time we meet an individual, we're going to have to not ask them their pronouns, we're going to have to ask them their sex.
Yeah.
So when I'm going to have to say, oh, hey, Kev, what's your sex?
Yeah.
So that I know what pronoun to use, which we don't do. If I bumped into you in the street, I'd go, Kev's a bloke, and I'll call him him.
Yeah, pretty much.
And
you kind of see them when they're trying to use, they're being really pedantic or being very ideological about pronouns, and they're calling people like me she. There's always like this hesitation where they have to rethink, because like you look at me and he just comes out naturally, like like it's one of those things. You see lots of trans women and she just comes out naturally, like, so they have to actually pause for half a second and rejig what they're about to say, and it's like, everyone can see that that's going on.
That's right. And also, everyone can see that going on when someone like me, who doesn't look female, demands the use of female pronouns. I want everyone to call me her and she, which I don't do. I'm totally happy with people calling me he and him and whatever, because that's clearly I'm male and people can see that. And what I've seen people like me who are, in their 50s and what have you, demanding that people call them by female pronouns. And you can even see the people they know, they have that pause, because what they're really seeing in front of them is a man in a dress, kind of, and I know that can be a derogatory term for some trans people, but that's kind of the reality of what I am. Like when I go out in public, I kind of look like a man in a dress, and although I don't wear dresses, so to speak, but
being a farmer.
Yeah, exactly. This is where I have actually found some other trans people who have a similar view to me, in that, pronouns should be just something that just come natural. And the demanding of it by the trans community and the demanding of it in the opposite way by gender critical and radical feminists are both kind of ridiculous positions, in that they should just be natural, So, like if I meet someone who totally looks like a woman and they're female and they want me to call them him, well, you're just kind of making it hard on yourself, You do. I kind of found myself, because I bumped into this when I first started to transition, and there was a younger guy that he was 17, hanging out with this FM support group, and he wasn't. I think at the time, you weren't legally allowed to transition without parental support unless you were 18. So basically he had decided, I can't remember what the backstory is, but he was waiting until he was 18 to transition, and he was this like really like butch dyke, looked like a boy, kind of like was really awkward, geeky kind of dude, but clearly a woman. And he started hanging around, and we just kind of all started assuming, and he had a guy name. He introduced himself with a guy name, and everybody was using male pronouns for him. And it took me a minute at first, but it kind of was like, well, I really like this guy. He's, like, it's not a big deal, and we kind of did it. And that was the only place where, and he didn't demand it, but we just all started doing it because it was important for him. He was having in a shitty waiting room phase of his life, where that was the only place he got heed, and everywhere else he got sheed. And I kind of got used to that over time. Like, it didn't take me long, but I got used to calling people opposite pronouns to, depending on what I could see they were going for. So if someone doesn't pass or doesn't quite pass but is making an effort, then I would naturally call you she.
just because I've been trained that way. But when it comes to people demanding, that's when I kind of go, oh, I can appreciate that it really sucks, but that's just not it. Like, it's not, getting really militant about that just means naturally you're going to get pushback. Like, you're better off kind of going with the tide a little bit and, having people like you you know what I mean? Like, getting to the point where everyone likes you so that they're happy to oblige rather than demanding, and being aware in some day-to-day situations, you're just going to get misgendered, and yes, it's going to suck. And hopefully over time, we can resolve this stuff. But getting angry about this puts people off, and it upsets you. It upsets you more than you would than you necessarily need to be upset. Like, you're better off to just, it's better to come from within than from without.
My experience also is that I actually think that it exacerbates dysphoria. So when you start demanding that people call you a certain pronoun or whatever, it might not be for everyone, but I've seen it in some people, and I've kind of, in different areas in myself, I've noticed this, that it creates the process where you start thinking about that, and then it tends to bother you more, and you become hyper vigilant and what have you.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to talk too much tonight about the craziness of the trans community, but this is one of the issues that I have with the whole trans ideology. Is it kind of demands that everybody does that. It demands that, kind of like, you need to fight for your pronouns, and I've chosen to take a different path, and it's actually helped me. It's empowered me by not taking that path. But stories like mine are always erased. They never put out one way to be. That's the trans ideology way. I was talking to one person on the internet who was a male person transitioning, and he said that everyone was still calling him, but every now and then people would use she and her, and he said that basically he was just using that as a measurement of his transition. And he said, it's a process. It's not just I am a this and suddenly it all, you wave a magic wand and that's how it was. A part of his transition, and that in time he felt that more and more people would see him as female, which is what he desired. And he just said that he just used it as a mirror. And I thought, well, that's an interesting perspective, the way he used it. But those kind of stories are never talked about.
Yeah, and they're kind of the stories of how, like, in a lot of ways, how we got here. Like, I didn't demand anybody ever, like, not even my parents. I didn't even ask my parents, like, to call me he or Kevin. Like, I kind of just was like, well, this is going on, blah, 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 and then let them kind of do their own thing. And it was surprising because it took no time at all. Like, it just happened, at their own pace, and everybody jumped on board, and it was, much easier than I anticipated it would be. But because
so it's just a process.
Yeah, but because there was no social media back then, like, there was nowhere to really tell these bits of information, so they just got lost over time. And I kind of wonder if this generation of people transitioning kind of have seen, like, because they don't know, they've only been told stories about what happened in the past, and they've seen, everybody jump on board for people like me in general, like, and blah 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 blah. That they kind of have misconstrued how that came about, because there wasn't any social media for us to have these conversations. So we kind of had them privately, which means in public, not at all. So there's no historical record of how this came to pass. So, they're kind of trying to find their own way now without the relevant information of how, 2 or 3 generations of people have gotten to the place that they've gotten to. Because you see stories. I saw one yesterday on Facebook of this person who hasn't even started transition yet, who's in a relationship, presumably currently a lesbian relationship, and one of the partners is wanting to transition to male or to masculinize in some way. I wasn't quite clear on how far they wanted to go, but was saying that their partner had flat outright at this point refused to call her him as part of the transition. I mean, they even still have a girl name as their Facebook name. So they're very early in, and it was just like 150 dump her responses in reply. Not any of them really were, well, there were a couple, but there weren't many. Give it time, let her get used to the idea. You've just, she's just kind of been blindsided by this. Just give her a minute to get her head around it and figure out what it means for her, because it does mean almost as much for her as it means for you, because you're her partner, you live together. This is big for her too. Just kind of chill for a minute and appreciate that, things will get better, but you just kind of have to be a little bit patient about it. But I kind of wonder how much that plays into what's happening as well.
Yeah, just going straight to the immediate dumper.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So look, we're going to talk a bit more about some of the concerns coming out of the gender critical, radical feminists and trans critical comments and what have you. I wonder if you saw the recent post by Charlie Kirk, whoever he is. Well, actually, I saw someone post on social media. It was a video of Charlie Kirk giving some kind of a speech somewhere. And he's saying that if we don't end this transgenderism, it's the end of the Western civilization and what have you. And I don't know. I kind of feel that this just these obscene positions seem to have really come to the fore in the last year or two. A couple of years ago, the trans critical community, which includes all that whole the radical feminists, the gender critical feminists, the religious groups, the straight out full-on transphobics, all those people who often critique of the trans community, there was kind of they were trying to be a little bit realistic, and the real transphobia in that movement was trying to keep a lid on that real transphobia. But now it just seems to have just recently just fully butt out, and it's like they can no longer hold back, and it's like the volcano that the pressure's built and now it's just erupting,
Ready to blow, yeah. Yeah, and it always happens. I saw that post, and it didn't. That's kind of one of the surprising things, is that it's just not surprising at all that's this person saying, if we, with all the other stuff that's happening at the moment, all of the, the social warrior sort of stuff, it's the trans thing that's going to bring the world to its end. That's not even really surprising at this point. And it's just people are going to read that. People are going to see that message, dude. I just don't.
I know. It's so ridiculous that it's kind of hard to give a proper critique, isn't it? It's the reality is that trans people are still a tiny percentage of the population. We really have very little impact on the real things that actually keep society going, like the production of food, the distribution of wealth, access to education and medicine, all those things that actually keep us in a constructive society. We just don't have any impact. We're not going to, trans people are not going to have any impact on climate change or all these other big issues, but these whackers are like the end of civilization, It's kind of,
and then, I find that just just kind of sad, to be honest. It's like, oh, you know, because it's, you know, there kind of seem to be, I don't know, I don't, there seem to be a lot of, you know, really big issues around trans stuff that need to be answered, and they need, they're questions that have needed to be addressed for decades that haven't been addressed, because every time that there's a critique, it just goes into crazyville. Like, you know, the people, like, they just can't hold it together enough to get it to the finish line. It always falls apart before that point, which is, well, because they're so extreme, it's not that, you know, I'm not that upset for them, but, you know, like, there are serious issues about what this means, and research, and, you know, like, all of that sort of stuff that really needs to happen, that never does, because we're going to be the end of the world, you know, like, people making insane statements.
Yeah, and then what was it? There was another one that was equally as crazy. I've forgotten what it was on social media in the recent period. How do you feel about this whole the whole transgender thing is to disassociate us from our bodies in preparation for the transhumanism, where we become connected to machines and whatever? Like, how do you feel about that whole thing?
Yeah, but like, I don't pay that. It's just,
you don't pay it.
You know, like, whatever happens in future generations, like, see, that's the thing, is these things never, like, what has ever worked out societally in the way it's been predicted to work out, like, by doomsday people, like,
yep.
You know, it just never, you know, people are banging on about the transhumanist stuff, which is kind of, you can see how geeky people think that's fantastic and are geeking out about it all, but they can't, you know, like, AI is having massive issues, because perception is so much more difficult than they realized. So they're going off about this transhumanist space stuff. Meanwhile, there's like Metaspace on Facebook that's just been launched, like, so that generations of people are being encouraged more and more to live their entire life just in the virtual realm. And it's like, we're a physical species. Like, I kind of think that Metaspace is more of a direct current threat to society than transhumanism, you know, in the current moment. Like, I just don't take it that seriously, to be honest. Like, what do you make of it?
Oh, well, I just think it's complete and utter nonsense. You know, trans people's, that whole thing, it stems from like this conspiracy theory that people are trans because of a top-down, you know, thing that makes us trans. So somewhere at the top of this pyramid, somebody makes a decision that they want people to transition, and somehow they've put in place some kind of a social order or something that forced me to have dysphoria and to want to be female, you know. And I just think that whole thing is just so far-fetched and ridiculous. You know, it's tinfoil hat type stuff.
Yeah.
And then the idea that they've got in place this plan to hook us all up to machines and what have you. Well, the technology just isn't there. So they can have all the plans they want, but the technology isn't there, so it can't happen anyway. And you know, and I've seen a number of the gender critical radical feminists sharing this crap, and I just think it's really actually a pity to the respect that I have got for their feminism in the areas that I agree. I think it completely undermines their feminism when they share this shit. And I kind of think that's all fairyland stuff, when the real thing that's really happening is all those feminists and all the rest of us are glued to social media and Twitter and Facebook and all the other TikToks and all the rest, instead of being out developing real interpersonal relationships, human to human. And if we're going to talk about some kind of how technology is going to destroy some part of humanity, well, then that's where the discussion would be.
Yeah.
And they're all victims of it as much as us poor trans people are.
Yeah.
Because that's, there's lots of radical feminists who are spending 7 days and 7 nights a week glued to their computers and their technology. Well, is that healthy? I don't think it is personally.
Yeah, that's like, you're already living in a virtual world. You don't need the machine body. Like, you just don't have to leave the house or leave your device at home. Like, I don't see that's one of the things with transhumanism that I really haven't paid that much attention to it. I haven't taken it very seriously because it just seems so outrageous. And social media seems to be much more, you know what I mean? Like, it's like they're concerned about this big, deep, dark thing down the road when right here and now we're all completely ensconced in a virtual world rather than the physical world. You know what I mean? Like, we're already there. Like, we don't need to worry about, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of just like this crazy disconnect thing where it's like we're already completely not living in our bodies mostly already. Like, what's going to happen with future technology is not really, you know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't make much sense to me.
Oh, sorry, I had a thought about something then that slipped my mind. Is there something else that you want to, while I'm looking through my notes, is there something else that you've sort of been biting at the bit to chat about?
Yeah, basically where to start. Like, there's so little balance, and I keep expecting people that I respect, people that I like, that I admire, that are obviously highly intelligent, that have just accepted the premise of some argument that makes no sense whatsoever. It's just like, and
all right, I've got that, and this one, this example that I see trans people who I support, the issues that they're raising in social media and what have you about concern with the trans community. But I see even some of the trans people being drawn into this. Actually, two of the people I saw drawn into it recently was the two Aarons, Aaron P and I'm not sure.
K,
yeah, which you've spoken to those guys, haven't you?
Yeah, I really like them.
Yeah, and I support the fact that they're trying to have, a proper discussion,
important discussion, yeah.
Yeah, and look at and they're trying to have it in a way that looking at the complexity of the issue instead of just simple answers, But I saw them drawn into something. It was going back in one of their older videos where they were drawn into this idea that this whole chest feeding, the removal of the word woman from a whole heap of things has been starting to take place and what have you. And what they've said is that they were sort of blaming this. They were certainly blaming it on males who identify as trans women, and I think from memory they were specifically saying that it's probably AGP trans women that are causing this. And I just think that there's no evidence that that's true. I think that's a load of nonsense. I actually sat in on a panel to help advise Bowen Health, which is the biggest health provider outside of the capital city of Melbourne in Victoria. I sat on a panel on that to talk about how Bowen Health could best serve the health needs of trans people. I was accompanied by trans guys, and it wasn't me who raised it. It was them who raised it, that they sort of said things like, well, if I've got to go in for a mammogram, people are seeing me as a woman. Well, I find that problematic, right? Whereas no AGP is going to go in for a mammogram and say, I've got a problem with you seeing me as a woman. Yeah. That's precisely what they want, is to be seen as a woman.
Yeah.
Right? My personal experience actually hearing it from the mouth of trans men is it's trans men who, when they have to go and see a gynecologist or someone like that who specialises in female health, that they don't be seen as women and called women and what have you. With the birthing parents, trans women never have children.
Yeah.
Right? The only people in the trans community who can have children is trans men. And it's those trans men who are wanting words like wanting words like birthing parent.
Yeah.
So that's coming out of the trans men's community. And unfortunately, the feminists, like the radical feminists and the gender critical feminists, they are not actually looking at the real world of who's calling for this. They've, through an ideological position, come up with that, which surprise, surprise, it's males, that they've come up with is what the problem is. That's the answer, is that it's males are the ones doing this. And I think it's unfortunate when trans people get sucked into that as well. Yeah. And so to guys like those two Aarons, they sort of said that they've really had no involvement in the trans community. They're off living their own life and whatever. And their real only experience with the trans community in recent years is through the internet. The internet is a really poor way to try and understand the world. If you really want to understand people, go and embed yourself in the real world community. And if you go and, I was involved in a trans support group. I went to all the statewide things for the LGBTIQA plus community and all the rest, and my experience from that is that I've never, ever met one single trans woman who doesn't want the word woman used. That's precisely what they want used,
Yeah, I think it's trans guys.
No trans woman takes hormone, ends up with breasts
and says, I don't want to be,
so that they can be referred to as a chest. They want their chest to be called breasts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that point kind of ties into a lot of the larger stuff, like people thinking, and you can see why they think, like, they've been banging on about this for years. They're really upset. They think it's really important. No one's been listening to them. They've been called every name under the sun, and then suddenly they start to get some traction over time. They get more frustrated, and they start thinking that people are deliberately not listening, or people are out to get them, or, like this whole thing that is spread so far and wide, mainly because people want to do the right thing. They want to be inclusive. It's not that people are out to... They just don't quite get that it diminishes women in some ways. They just don't quite see that because they're busy over here trying to be inclusive. So, like, there's a lot of that sort of stuff happening where there's, like, some trans guys have said, I want it to be a chest rather than breasts, or, that's problematic. And then other people jump on the bandwagon and start assuming that that's the case for everybody, thinking that that's the right thing to do, and not having a conversation about it, or not really stopping to think and just trying, going along with things. And then suddenly it starts looking conspiratorial. But I don't know that it really is. Like, I haven't really seen much evidence for, deep, dark basement conspiracy type theories that people seem willing and eager to believe. It's just like a lot of this is explained very simply from thinking that people are trying to be nice. Like, that explains a hell of a lot of this. Like, but for some...
I think that, if you take a proper look at human behaviour and actually try and have some empathy for the people that you're talking about and whatever, and understand where they're coming from, you can always see that it's not because of some deep, dark conspiracy and what have you. So the radical feminist and gender critical community, who I agree on, a number of issues and what have you, the things that I disagree with them on, I kind of understand what was the process that took them to that position that I see as a wrong position. And, you've already alluded to that when these women have been held down and threatened with violence, and there's some gender critical and radical feminists who have actually been attacked by trans women in public, and when they've suffered all that frustration and what have you, then it provides, a fertile ground for poor ideas.
Yeah.
Likewise, the trans community has actually been through a lot of struggle. And there's people in the community who have really suffered heavily for coming out and being trans and what have you. And so, again, that creates a fertile field for a poor analysis and poor behaviour and what have you.
Yeah.
And, you know, the trans community as a collective is, in my experience, basically the vast majority of trans people are just like the rest of society. They're really good people just trying to get on with life.
Yeah.
But at times, as a collective, we're making bad decisions and taking on bad politics and what have you, because of the struggles in life that we as a community have historically faced and still in some areas face today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, you know, quite true. I've been, such a weird one, because it's like, how do you, like, I was having a conversation. I had a Zoom conversation with a trans woman from a different country who is quite prominent and very well known, and was really lovely, great conversation. And throughout the process of this conversation, the electricity in her building went down, and she had to go outside to see what the problem was while she had no lights. And while we're on the phone, she had to mute me because her neighbour had come out at the same time and started giving her a mountain of shit about being transsexual or transgender in her, like, she couldn't even leave her own apartment building without copying it, you know. And she's you know, possibly one of the most famous trans rights people alive today, and even she can, you know what I mean, like, she can barely, you know, get out of her house in that instance without copying a mouthful of, you know, like, what seemed to be really quite nasty harassment. And the guy could see that she was on a video, like, he could see she was on the phone, and he just didn't give a shit, just started giving it to her. And she was like, hold on a minute, and muted me, and then kind of, you know, was like calming this guy down, and then ejected herself. And it's like, when that is a common experience, like, people may or may not, like, they're not really being killed and, you know, murdered at the huge rates that, you know, people in the past, but they're still copying a mountain of shit every day. How do you have a nuanced conversation when half the people that you know what I mean, like, when that's still happening? How do you get people to separate their emotional life? Because you're talking about people's lives here, like, that kind of seems to be lost in a lot of places as well. Like, you see people going, well, no one's being murdered, so what's their problem? And it's like, yeah, they're still having trouble just getting through the day. Like, the amount of hoo-ha that is on social media about this at the moment, how it's become such a big thing, is kind of a very vibrant demonstration of how not okay people are with trans people in general. Like, this is still a hot topic. So how you get people to separate, to actually have a single conversation on either side, is, I have no idea at this stage.
Just to pick up on something like that you spoke about, then trans people, you know, in the Western world, like in a country particularly like Australia, you know, we don't face death on a daily basis or anything like that. We don't even face violence on a daily basis. So the trans community, you know, in Australia grossly exaggerate our facing violence and what have you. But that's also then no excuse to kind of say that it never happens.
Yeah.
And we see that. So on one hand, we see the trans community making the most absurd and ridiculous kind of statement about it, and then we see the polar opposite, that it never happens, and then even the dismissiveness of it, where I've seen from, you know, from the RADFEM and the gender critical community, that kind of when a trans woman is murdered, it's kind of like dismissed because it was by their partner. They sort of go, oh, well, it wasn't transphobia at all because they were killed by their partner, right? But if ever you said it to any of those
if it was by a woman, then that would not be okay to say.
Absolutely. If you said, well, it wasn't misogyny because it was the husband who killed them. You know, in Australia, there's 60 ex-partners and husbands and whatever kill their female partners every year, more than one a week, which is horrific, what have you. And if you were to downplay that by saying, oh, but it's not misogyny because it's their partner or ex-partner, well, that would be completely unacceptable. And so it's completely unacceptable when they say some nonsense like it can't be related to transphobia because it was their husband or partner or whatever that killed the trans woman. It can certainly still be influenced by transphobia.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
You know, I actually I don't have permission to talk about it on the internet to give any kind of details, but a very, very close contact to me was actually believed to have been murdered in a hate crime because that person was out and about as a gender questioning person a number of years ago in Australia. So say that it doesn't happen, to the heartbreaking situation of that family and those of us who knew that person is just the wrong thing to be doing.
Yeah, pretty much.
You know, in the same way that if I was dismissive of any violence against to anybody else in it. You know.
Yeah, there's just a lack of balance that is kind of driving me bananas at the moment. Like the people that, like, there is one side that don't want to believe anything bad whatsoever, and there's another side that just will not believe anything good. And it's like, oh, how you move on from here, I have no idea.
Well, we see that around surgery, you know, so trans surgery. So, you know, groups in Australia like the Coalition for Biological Reality, you know, are wanting society to have an open discussion on banning trans surgery, you know, and that's just dog whistling for transphobia is what that is. Yeah. Well, for starters, that group of people are incapable, and they should know it within themselves, that they're incapable of really having a proper discussion about trans surgery, because in their own eyes, you know, by their own words, you've seen it just like anyone else follow this.
Yeah.
The trans community to them is this battlefield that they're involved in for a war of survival of women, for survival of women as a group in society, for females as a group in society. So they're in the war of their lifetime. Is it sensible that they could then kind of say, and we're going to talk about surgery because we care so deeply about trans people?
Yeah.
Like, you know, it would be kind of like the English during the Second World War when the Germans were dropping bombs on England, the English saying we're going to advocate for good health care for German people, you know, like it's ridiculous.
Yeah. And it's completely transparent as well. Like, it's just so obvious. Like,
yeah. And so all they're interested in sharing is they scour the internet, they scour all the trans forums and what have you, trying to dredge up any little bit of information they can find where people are dissatisfied with their surgeries, where people have had complications with their surgeries, etc. And then they try and that's all they're interested in. Yeah, they're not interested in sharing that in a way that is supportive or helpful for that person or whatever. All they wanting to do is use that to weaponise against surgery and against the trans community. Quite frankly, I think you might have had this discussion with me recently where it's in the area of vulgar that they would trawl through, you know, trans pages and what have you that are set up for trans people to discuss these issues of complications and what have you.
In a private, discreet online forum. You know, you see this a lot. You see it with detransitioners as well. There was an article out of Texas, I think last week or the week before, I think it was this week, where they talk about one of the they're not famous, they're kind of well-known detrans people that have done a few interviews here and there. They did this article about this detransitioned woman who I have seen a couple of times interviewed, and she's kind of a regretter in that she's like, well, I'm like, she doesn't yeah, it's kind of one of those things where she's like, that was something that I had to do. And, like when you talk to a lot of the transitioners, if they're asked the question, is there anything before you transition when you were on the path to transitioning? Is there anything that anyone could have said to you to make you think twice? And the answer is generally no. But they did this article about her. So so she said, no, there's nothing that anyone could have done to stop me. I'm pig-headed. I wanted to do it. I thought it was the right thing at the time. It was a life learning lesson, and I have moved on from that. Like it's traumatic for some of them, and that's gut-wrenching, and I think that's an area that we need to look at, but it's not that situation for all of them. Some of them, kind of process it and kind of start moving past it. Anyway, so they did this article, and I read this article, and I was like, this sounds weird. This is written weirdly. I wonder if they've even spoken to her. And then one of her videos popped up on my YouTube, and I was watching it, and it had a link to her Instagram. So I clicked on the link, and the first thing that came up on her Instagram is a picture of her with this article going, I suppose I'm famous now. They didn't even contact me to speak to me about this article. They just trolled all of this information online, correlated it, and, did a news article about it without even contacting her. So they're basically just, well, they are putting a spin on her story that is not from her at all. And it's like, at some stage that's going to come out.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I've trolled the internet to try and find stories from detrans people so that I can understand what's going on. Not with any desire to weaponize that, but of course to try and understand what the phenomenon is, who's it happening to, and what have you. What sort of support those people need, and what sort of steps we need to put in place to try and reduce that so that it doesn't happen again in the future,
Yeah.
And certainly one of the things that I think it's kind of changed a little bit, but not that long ago, one of the things that was coming through with a lot of the detrans people is that they were saying that it was kind of the whole transition and detransition was a process they felt that they had to go through in life to kind of learn what they needed to learn in life to move forward.
Yeah.
And I thought that was quite an interesting take on it,
Yeah, I kind of think at the same time, like you hear horrific stories about someone who had basically castration surgery at 18, 3 months after they started estrogen. Like, like there are some real horror stories out there that need to be like that shouldn't happen. Like 18 is so young. But yeah, what to do about that? But I don't know. But I don't think being hyperbolic in either direction is going to service that, that argument, because you need people to take you seriously, and you need to be as unbiased as you possibly can be when you're talking to third parties about this stuff, so that they believe you, so that they make up their own minds. Like an 18-year-old regretter who was on estrogen for 3 months before having castration surgery is bad enough. Like it doesn't need any ad-libbing. Like you don't need to add to that story. It's bad. Like how that happens, you know what I mean? Like, and how often it happens, like that needs to be gotten to the bottom of. But because it's been happening for a while now and no one's really been paying attention, the people that are telling these stories are getting more and more and more and more and more frustrated. So they keep upping the ante, and it's getting to the point now where it's just hard to take it seriously. It's like there's just so much hyperbolic kind of stuff on top. It's like, I don't, like if you're so over the top about this bit, what else is, let's have a look at under the rest of it, because I'm not sure how much to believe now. Like that's kind of what happened to me. Like I was like, I came in, I saw Abigail Shrier on Rogan, and I was like, oh shit, like groups of girls transitioning in friendships groups, there's only one thing that can be, And then the detransition was another huge thing for me because in 20 years, I'd only seen 3 or 4 stories of that. And then over time, like just the pushing of, of the bias, of the capture of, like it can only be this, and this means this, and this, and we need evidence-based medical care and research to find out what's going on. And then while they're waiting for the data to come back, they make all of these assumptions and then add on and on and on and on and on. And you're like, okay, well, now you've just completely undermined yourself, and I don't know what you're about, but I'm going to take a step back here. Like, I'm not sure. That's pretty much what happened to you as well, isn't it? More or less.
No, the thing that made me decide that I was kind of done with the whole sort of trans ideology side was around the claim that you don't even hear anymore, which is trans women pose no threat to women. So that was something that, going back some time ago, was a real thing. Trans women pose no threat to women. And what happened is, in the group of trans people that, I want to be a bit careful here, in the group of trans people that I was around, I wasn't there, but a trans woman came out to the group and said they'd been accused of rape in the past. And then a trans woman, I organised a camp for trans and gender non-conforming people in Victoria, and it was a really successful weekend, and everyone loved it. It was like, I hope this is going to be an annual thing and what have you. But I came away from there and found out one of the trans women who was a very vulnerable type of person in the way she presented and what have you, was actually sexually assaulted on the camp by another trans. And the funny thing is, my gut feeling about the other trans woman, the sexually aggressive trans woman, was, from the time I met that person, which I'd met them several times before, I'd always just had a gut kind of sense that I don't like this person. And I swept that aside on the basis of that's not being inclusive, right? And so what happened is, through the whole experience, I recognised the danger of that when we start demanding inclusivity in a way that removes that kind of acknowledgement that those real threats can be there and what have you, then it's dangerous. And then when I started to look into that, there's absolutely no doubt that trans women in our community, we have rapists, we have pedophiles and what have you. You're in the clear. Your community, the trans guys, basically don't, right? It's my, within the trans community, there's your trans guys and there's my community, which is the trans women, and they're in my community. And so I feel that that's something that we need to acknowledge and we need to speak up about and we need to confront and we need to do something about and what have you. And I think that if we're honest and open about it and we have that discussion with the Australian public, we can keep the Australian public on our side, which I think they are on our side. I think the vast majority of the Australian people, we can keep them on our side and we can be good citizens and participate in society and what have you, by being open and saying these are the challenges that we have to wrestle with as a community. But unfortunately, the whole LGBTIQA plus community will not even acknowledge that. So in Geelong, which was the community that I was involved in, the LGBTIQA plus community, there's a number of women in that community who are either lesbians or allies or whatever they are in that community, who are activists about things like the Catholic Church and its assault on children and what have you. And yet they will not talk about anything to do with trans people having rapists and what have you in our community. And if you lock into the radical feminist and gender critical community and what have you, on a weekly basis, they have a new story to share. You know, it was only a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure if it went to, I think it went to court only a couple of weeks ago, or the person was charged or something. But there was a trans woman in Melbourne in the streets approached
that grabbed someone.
Yeah. You know, tried to grope on their genitals in public and what have you. And the fact that we can't even have a talk about that, and you know, one of the things that I think the trans women's community has got to have the same discussion as the male men's community, which is something that I've pushed for in the male men's community, is we've got to have that discussion about boundaries and recognising boundaries and what have you. And nobody wants to have that discussion. And what the gender critical feminists and the radical feminists have got wrong about all of that is that they think that's all just driven by, of course, AGP trans people, you know, who are sexual fetishists and whatever, and that's why no one's talking about it and what have you. Again, they come to that position from an ideological position. They don't go and actually embed themselves in the LGBTIQA plus community for 5 years and observe what happens. Because if they did, if they went and observed what happens in that community, that whole thing, that whole shutting down of that is actually policed by women, by females, by lesbian and bisexual women and their allies. So, you know, like the people who won't allow that discussion to happen in Victoria is the now retired Commissioner for Gender and Equality, who was a female person, and her female partner. They don't want us to have that discussion. And then, you know, if you keep coming down the ladder, you know, like the lesbian people in the Geelong community, they don't want to have that discussion. The lesbian people in the Southwest activists don't want to have that discussion.
There's a whole... Yeah.
The whole youth, the whole trans youth thing is not ran by men. It's ran by women. It's mothers who the whole trans children thing and what have you is not run by men. In my experience, it might be different somewhere else in the world, but in my experience, in my community, it's ran by women. Right? It's not ran by AGP males and whatever. It's ran by mothers, and they don't want any discussion around this either. You know, and certainly, I don't want to have a discussion around it, which is what's happening in the radical feminist, gender critical, and the Coalition for Biological Reality type community. I don't want to have the discussion that they're having, where what they're trying to do is paint every trans-identified male person, whether they're non-binary, whether they're a trans woman or whatever, but every male person is a rapist. You know, and that's kind of the claim that some of them are getting to. Certainly not all of them, but it's kind of the claim that some of them are getting to, and it's just so ridiculous, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting watching straight people discuss LGBTQI whatever plus communities when they really just have no idea. They really don't quite understand, like, you know, domestic violence rates amongst, you know, lesbian and gay men are, you know, not that far behind, if at all, you know, the general population. Like, you know, people kind of think that like a lesbian couple, two women living together is just all sunshine and light and togetherness. And it's like, no, it's serial monogamy, you know, affairs, treachery, like, you know, a lot of the gay men that I have met over my lifetime, you know, their first, you know, sexual experience, a lot of them, their first sexual experience as young gay men coming into the community was, you know, like rapish sex. Like, it's not, you know, they kind of do this thing. I think this is a conversation that I had with you. Like, they want to have conversations about how bad the trans community is and what deep, dark, dirty secrets are lying in our community, while like, oh no, don't, you know, like, you can't touch theirs. Like, it's like there's this unrealistic expectation that trans people are being held to some kind of higher standard of behavior than anybody else is able to achieve. But as trans people, we should be able to, because, you know, just because, like, it's a bit ridiculous.
Well, the real because just because the real word that's actually there is it's subtle form of transphobia.
Yeah.
Transphobia, it is a real thing and it does actually exist. Even though I've had some some feminists argue with me that they don't. That I've been told that transphobia transphobia can't exist because because gender isn't the whole gender ideology of gender is an internal sense of self and what have you is not real. So because that's not real, you can't be transphobic. Well, that's kind of as ludicrous as saying, I don't believe in Allah. Look, I don't know if you're religious or not. I hope I'm not being offensive, but I'm an atheist, and so I don't believe in Allah, right? But I can still be Islamophobe. I can still be an Islamophobe, right? I can still use language that is deeply offensive of Muslim people.
Yeah.
Whether I believe.
Because whether Allah is real or not is irrelevant to the fact that there are a couple of million people that worship him. Like,
yeah, the whole idea that because trans ideology in their view isn't a real thing, therefore transphobia can't exist, is just such a flawed argument.
Yeah, and the idea. I kind of have been procrastinating quite hard about making my solo video because it's a real pain in the ass. But I was kind of going to do a video about, there's this assumption in gender critical, like just across the board in many places. Like, it's not everywhere, but in general, people all seem to have this basic assumption that if you're trans, then you ascribe to gender ideology just as part of the course. And it's like, these are academic ideas that were kind of around, but no one took them seriously until sometime after 2010. So it's only kind of infected this recent group of people that have been taught this stuff, that are into it, that suits them. They're the people that are into it. And there are a couple of generations of trans people that came before them that don't know anything about it. Like, I reached out to the guy that used to run F2M Australia, which is a support group that was here in Sydney. And because he ran that for close to a decade easily. And I kind of said to him, hey, have you seen what's going on? And he was like, no, what's going on? And I was like, well, haven't you seen what's going on social media? And he's like, oh, no, I'm, busy living my life. And then I spoke to another guy that I transitioned with, who is in Canberra. And I was like, hey, have you seen this stuff? You should check this out. And he was like, no, I'm busy. Like, I kind of think that the majority of trans people are successfully transitioned out in the community, living their, day-to-day lives, miserably or happily, or however their lives are going. But unless there's a problem, you're not really going to come back to the community, or unless you're, like a geeky person who's into, social media and internet and all that sort of stuff, you're not really going to necessarily know that this is happening. It hasn't really hit the mainstream yet, and everybody's busy with their lives, and there are all these, like confirmation bubbles where you only see the things that you want to see. So, like, people are kind of assuming malice, thinking that everybody must know about the gender part of the culture war by now because they've known about it for years. And it's like, I don't know that that's the case, firstly. And secondly, not every trans person has any idea who Judith Butler is, or what her ideas on, the dishes are, let alone what her ideas on gender are. Like, it's not necessarily that widespread, but everybody kind of keeps making these grand assumptions. And because everybody that they're interacting with on a daily basis, because they're all online in the same groups, chatting to the same people, scanning the same papers day after day after day, that's all they're seeing. So they kind of have reinforced with each other, like, that this is the case. Like, everybody who's trans must be aware of gender ideology and queer theory and be a signed up member. And they, transitioned because they were, like, in the wrong body or this, that, and the other. And it's like, from having been in the trans community for 20 years, I promise you that's not the case. Like, everybody, because you're growing up and you're different, but you can't figure out how you're different quite. And then you kind of slowly start to figure it out. But between that point and when you actually go to the gender clinic, there could be decades involved. And there's no handbook of, oh, you're gender dysphoric, here's what this means, because, of course, they don't know what it means. They don't know what causes it. They don't know so much about this. So by the time you get to the gender clinic, you kind of have had to have already made up your mind on your own what you think about this, how you frame it, and your experiences and the people around you are the thing that impact that concept inside your brain the most. What's happening in an academic theory is only relevant to people that are in academia up until 2010, when it somehow got let out into the general community. Like, when did you first start bumping into these ideas?
I started to, I reckon, probably sometime in the last 10 years, on the internet, I started to see the argument develop, kind of, that trans women are real women because of blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it was really just in the last 10 years. Prior to that, I hadn't come across it at all. And the people, so surprise, surprise, and I think it was year 2000 was when I first got a PC. And surprise, surprise, one of the things I started straight away looking up was stuff about transgender stuff and what have you. And I found, it's that long ago now, 22 years ago, but I can't remember what the forum was or whatever, but I got in contact with another person who said that they go out socially in Melbourne, dressed feminine and what have you, and did I want to, and, we spoke about our issues and found that, for a lot of people, the internet was the first time that they, and I was one of those, it was the first time they actually spoke to people and shared that common, that's what I experienced as well,
Yeah.
And so this person's like, do you want to come up to Melbourne and whatever, you can change at my place and whatever. So I went up there and what have you, and so, she definitely wasn't saying, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body or anything else like that. Like, she didn't even have the words kind of back then, 22 years ago, to even kind of talk like that. And then I lost contact with her, and she ended up, she's post-operative now and she's transitioned, whatever. And probably the reason why I've lost contact with her is, like so many trans people, she's just got on with life, and she's out there just somewhere, just living life, minding her own business and getting along with people. But it's interesting. I came across someone a few years ago who was transitioning, a male person who was transitioning. His position was kind of still similar to some of the things I'd heard in the past, where he was like, I'm going to become a woman, right? Whereas by then, so this might be, say, 5 years ago maybe, by then so many in the trans community were saying, I always was a woman, I am a woman. This person was saying, I'm going to turn into a woman. Well, in trans ideology, there isn't even space for that, because in trans ideology, I always was a woman. Not I'm even got the possibility to turn into a woman, which this person kind of, their view was, I've been a man all my life and I'm going to change into a woman.
Yeah.
Well, that just doesn't even fit in trans ideology, because under trans ideology, you always were a woman. Just the world might have been a man, you know?
Yeah, I wonder, like with the radical feminist definition, how much of that comes down to just not understanding, like not quite speaking the same language, not having the same definitions of, because I saw a post like that today, and it was a bit of a cheeky post, but someone who has like this trans woman who has fully transitioned, fully passes, has done for decades. And it's that whole rebellious thing, like someone's going, oh, well, you were led astray to believe that you could become a woman. You've been fed lies. You're delusional. You believe that you've become a woman. And it's like, this person looks like a woman. She acts like a woman, like completely passes as a woman, has lived her life for decades as a woman. Like there's, I don't know, there's kind of, because there's, your chromosomal biological sex, your reproductive organs, but those things generally in day-to-day society aren't that important. Like what's on your birth certificate isn't necessarily, you know what I mean? Like there's this assumption that if I have when I had an F on my birth certificate, that was everything about me. You know what I mean? That was my chromosomes, like that reflected my chromosomes, or that reflected my reproductive organs, or maybe did it just perhaps reflect is your legal gender marker always representative of your social sex? Like, because you can like people that are like, oh, you can't change your biological sex, and then you see people arguing back and going, well, I have, so tough shit, too bad. Like, they're kind of like, are they talking at cross purposes? Like, some of it is definitely cheeky, some of it is definitely delusional. Like, I wasn't always a man, but at the same time, I was always rejected as female as well. Like, people, even when I was like a little kid or a teenager, like people that didn't even know me would be really hesitant to put me into the woman camp. They would be like, oh. And then when I came out as a dyke, I was always just a dyke. Like, they'd kind of skirt around the issue. So, there's kind of this, I kind of think biological reality is important, and we need to, you know what I mean? But at the same time, it's just not quite that simple in many ways. And people are talking about multiple different things in multiple different ways. And it just kind of occurred to me a couple of weeks ago, like, are these people even having the same conversation? Like, what are they? There's people talking, trans people talking about their social sex. They're not talking about their reproductive bits or their chromosomes. They're talking about their day-to-day life. And you're talking about their chromosomes. Like, it just is this weird, I don't know. Like, I kind of know where you stand on the issue, because we've had that conversation.
Yeah. I maybe another time, if you want to catch up, it'd be good to have a chat more in deeply about this. And I want to get bogged down into it now. Yeah. But what I see as the problem to finding the answer to these questions is that on one hand, the radical feminist gender critical position, or what have you, is basically arguing from a philosophical position of what's called formal logic, right? And the trans community are arguing from what is basically a postmodernist position, a philosophical position, which is postmodernism. And I actually think both are wrong. And I think we actually get a better answer coming from a Marxist philosophical position, which is dialectical materialism. And that's something I'd be happy to have a bit of a chat with you about and see if you can find any resonance in kind of my view on that. Because I think from that dialectical materialist position, which was the philosophy that Marx came up with, I think that we can kind of find how to categorise things. So basically, on the question of, this whole debate of, is there two sexes, or is there a multitude on this spectrum? Those two different arguments. One says there's only two sexes, and the other says know it's a spectrum and what have you, they're actually both saying, look at the science. And if you actually go and have a look at both are actually quoting the same science.
Yeah.
So they keep arguing over the same science, even though they both accept the same science, right? What they're actually arguing about isn't science. What they're actually arguing about is the philosophical question of how do we categorise in society. And that's what we need to have a talk about. How do we categorise in society? You know, when we get a piece of, you know, if we get a piece of copper and we get a piece of lead, the copper is copper and it's copper only. The lead is lead and it's lead only. But if we start to melt them together a little bit, at some point we'll have something we'll call brass.
Yeah.
Right? But at what point do we stop calling the copper copper and start calling it brass as we add the lead to it?
Yeah.
Right? These are actually important questions throughout the whole of life. It's the questions that philosophy has wrestled with, but they're also deep questions that things like engineering have to wrestle with, is how do we categorise?
Yeah.
And that's what the real argument on the question of how many sexes are there. It's a philosophical question of how do we categorise, but no one's having that proper philosophical debate and discussion. They're all going on about my science outdoes your science, but when you actually look into both of them actually agree on the science.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting...
It's kind of, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
You know. All righty. Well, look.
No worries.
Have a chat.
Yeah, thank you so much for chatting.